Epic D-Day success sets up victory against terrified money power. And no postal bank without post offices. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 30th of May 2024. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, Craig, we're going to talk about a victory we've had. Give me five. This is a genuine victory in the it's mission accomplished in a sense on the Senate inquiry into regional bank closures. Very, very happy with the result. So we'll give you all the details on that and what that sets us up for going forward. But the downside is our whole services, system of public services in Australia is under assault, and this victory couldn't come soon enough because unless we get the postal bank, we could find ourselves losing post offices in Australia on a massive scale, and then it'll be an even bigger problem than bank branch closure. So we need to intervene and expose that. But before we begin, remember. As we've said all along, this is not just information. We're trying to do something about what we talk about. We're an activist political party, and the way you can help us get the show around. We always need more viewers. The more viewers, the more potential activists, and we make a difference. As we're going to be talking about the big difference we've made on this show, in this issue, which is what today's show is about. So like the show, share it widely on social media, subscribe, and when you subscribe, remember to ring the bell icon. And ring the bell icon so that you get always notified, not just a one-off notification. Please comment below. The comments are really important. They're including for the algorithm, but excellent feedback, and I participate as much as I can. And donate. There's a donate button below. We always need your help to make this happen. We've expended a huge amount of effort and money in the last 15 months, Craig. Yeah, and it's all been worth it.
I mean, you've been to 13 out of the 13 hearings, and that's all over the country, in faraway places like Tom Price, and that's not a cheap exercise.
It was an effort.
The other thing, Rob, is we've been doing a series of what we call Shake Your Chains forums around the country. We've done 5, and we're about to start a series of them in New South Wales. 8th of June is the next one. And these are basically discussion forums, and presenting. We go forward and present the strategic reality of what we as an organisation face. You give strategic updates on what we have to do in the political sphere, and I give a bit of a history of our organisation as the founder. So people constantly ask, "Who are you guys? Where did you come from?" And I think people have been finding and very surprising about the depth of what we actually represent. And that, if people are interested in that, then they should call our 1-800 number, 1-800-636-432, ask to speak to an organiser, and our viewers and activists are welcome to come, but they must register beforehand. You can't sort of just rock up. Yeah. So that'll be important. We've got some in New South Wales.
I often tell people, Craig, when people say, "How come I've never heard of you before?" I say, "Well, we're the most successful political party in Australia no one's ever heard of." But that's changing, and it's got to change, and so your history stuff that you present there is quite important so people understand our history, because none of this success happened overnight.
No.
But now that it's happening, it seems to be becoming thick and fast.
Well, we're in our 36th year, and Robbie, we've never deviated from the policies we started with. They've got deeper, stronger, and the
number one policy has always been the same.
Yeah, absolutely. National bank,
public bank.
Yeah,
and that's why this is a great success.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We'll get into that in a second. Just one quick update before we begin the show proper. Just on the Daniel Duggan case, Craig. Last week's show was about Daniel Duggan. So the frustrating thing about last week's show, of course, is that we record on a Thursday, and both the report on the branch closures inquiry and the Dan Duggan hearing was the very next day, and so then you've got to wait pretty much a week to update people. Anyway, the bottom line with the Dan Duggan hearing is the media reporting on it was pretty shallow. One of the headlines was something like, the Duggan lawyer concedes no case to argue. It was a complete manipulation of the truth, that headline. The bottom line was this: the Duggan team have put forward his legal defence against what the Americans are charging with him with, so they can extradite him. And the other side came back in response to that and have said, made all sorts of claims, etc. But one of the things they made clear is that almost every detail is out of the jurisdiction of the local court where the hearing was, the magistrates' court, where the hearing was on Friday. And so Dan Duggan did get the SC Scott Walker that he was hoping to get, but very expensive. That's why they were raising money.
It always struck me as strange, Robbie, that a magistrate that looks at parking tickets as dealing with matters of national security.
No,
it's weird.
It just didn't make any sense. So the Scott Walker said, look, there's no point having this discussion in this forum. And so there's two, and in fact, some of the stuff is only in the jurisdiction of US courts, literally, right? So the whole point, though, is you don't want Duggan extradited to a US court, so the only intermediary is the Attorney General. And this is an issue where the Attorney General has to do the right thing. He has to uphold Australian law, especially this principle we explained of dual criminality, where our extradition treaty with the United States says you only get extradited if it's a crime in both countries. And what they're accusing Dan Duggan of was not a crime in Australia, right? And they're only retroactively fitting it as a crime in the United States anyway. So that's Australian law. The Attorney General has to uphold that and not bend Australian law to please the United States. And if anyone's following the global geopolitics at the moment, you would know that's the vulnerability. That's the issue right there. Because we're doing everything in our power as a country to bend over to please the United States on every front. And, you know, sometimes it's harder to relate to the consequences than other times. You know, war can seem like an academic, theoretical thing off in the distant future. The thing to relate to here is in order to please the United States, they are destroying an Australian family of 6 children, a wife and a husband. Dan Duggan became a permanent resident in 2002. He became an Australian citizen in 2012. This is where his life is. His family's Australian, and they are being destroyed so that our government can please the United States. That is wrong, and that's why the Australian people should be behind this case. And over the next month or so, we will continue to highlight this because we're going to need people, and you can do it already. Take the time to call your Member of Parliament, call or email your Member of Parliament and the Attorney General's office and say, do the right thing by Dan Duggan. The Australian people expect you to. Because, as I pointed out in another forum, Australia does so much business with China, any number of people could be the next Dan Duggan. There's a full court press in America to demonise any contact with China, even though the Chinese president addressed our parliament back in 2014 at the invitation of Tony Abbott, who's now one of the biggest China bashers in the country, trying to make up for that fact because he's trying to, and they're probably afraid, these people like Tony Abbott, he's trying to pretend that he's on the side, you know, oh no, I didn't do anything bad by doing that. No, he didn't do anything bad. It's our number one, biggest and best trading partner. We make $120 billion a year net profit out of our trade with China. Our trade with America costs us $40 billion. It's $40 billion in America's favour. We get the benefit of the trade with China. It's the mainstay of our economy, and these idiots are demonising it. But all the people involved in it, in the agriculture sector and the technology sector, anyone who's exporting to China can find themselves a target of this kind of McCarthyite, paranoid targeting. And Craig, if anyone, here's one reference point I hope people may be familiar with. If you've watched the movie Oppenheimer, which is the big movie of the year, it won all the Oscars. If you've watched it, you know what I'm talking about. The whole backdrop to that movie is about him being targeted by the House Un-American Activities Committee simply because he made the weapon, but he was horrified at what it was going to be used for, especially if they went down the path of a fusion bomb. And by expressing opposition to that, here's the hero of World War II, gets totally demonised and destroyed by this machine. And by 1960, the consensus was that whole period was insane. It was the equivalent of the Salem witch hunts from the 17th century. Everyone acknowledged this was a bonkers period. Everyone lost their minds. That was the acknowledgement. In fact, JFK, before he became president, came under suspicion because he hadn't condemned McCarthy enough. because people thought this was nuts. What we did in those 10 years was nuts. It's back. It is absolutely back. It's here in Australia now, and there's this Australian family being destroyed by it. So, you know, you've got to take this stuff seriously. That's why we're highlighting this case. And I'll get off my high horse on that. You can help immediately by making sure your Member of Parliament and the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, knows where you stand on this, because that kind of pressure is going to be quite important. All right, let's have a change of gears, because that was me letting my anger get to me over injustice, because we actually have a much better show than that today, which is a genuinely good news show, because we have had an immense victory. Epic D-Day success sets up victory against the terrified money power. And I'm equating it to D-Day, because D-Day, June 6, 1944, which is actually 80 years ago next week, sorry. D-Day that wasn't the day they won the war. It went on for another year, but the success of the D-Day invasion of Normandy is what was the turning point in the war. It set the whole thing up for the eventual victory in World War II. And this is what you can compare what's happened in the last week to that. We have gone through this incredible 15-month inquiry into bank branch closures, but the reason the Citizens Party got involved in that inquiry and pushed it so hard, in terms of the objective we hope to achieve, we have achieved. It's mission accomplished. We've got a major inquiry of the Australian Parliament to endorse, in principle, the idea of a public bank for Australia.
And it goes hand in hand with the other two issues, Robbie, because there's really three, which we'll go through in more detail. But what struck me was that they could have just come up with a public bank, but they didn't.
Yep.
They said, no, banking is an essential service.
Yep.
And no more of this voluntary code of conduct stuff. You guys are going to be held to account with a legal, mandatory code of conduct. With those three things, that means that the entire process of the banking can go back to being something sane. Because, you know, bankers are liars. I'm sorry. That's going to be the theme of our federal campaign. Bankers are liars, because whatever they say, you can't believe them. Look at the backflips that Matt Common's done and the dealing with Bank West and so forth. They say one thing, and then behind the scenes, they already know that they're going to be doing something different. They make these promises up front because their interests aren't in the interests of the general welfare and the general thriving of the economy. It's in private shareholder profits. And that's where our problem is. That's why we have to have a public bank, one that stands for the people and the interests of the people, rather than these private banks that are only interested in the shareholders and the superannuation companies.
The good news is, Craig, that the banks are squealing.
Oh, of course.
They're very unhappy at this outcome.
That's a good sign. That's proof it worked.
That is. It proves we're on the money. Let's go through the recommendations, which came out after 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon.
You were sweating
last
it pretty
week.
big. I could feel your sweat from in here.
It was
Robbie.
a bad sign. Like I'm thinking, and I'm talking to other people, and we're thinking, oh man, you know, anything that gets released Friday afternoon, you know, is stuff that they just want to brush under the carpet. This is not a good sign. Because I'd said many times, people can remember, if you're a regular watcher of this show, I was forewarning people, look, I don't think the inquiry is going to recommend a public bank as long as it recommends something strong. Well, all my fears were allayed, because it was just process that stopped it from being released sooner, but when it came out, it was absolutely dynamite. And hats off to, I'll acknowledge some people later, but now, hats off to the chairman, Matt Canavan. And the reason, he not only did he do a good job chairing the inquiry, but he's the one who had to make sure that when push came to shove and the recommendations were put on paper, knowing all the pressure, he's in a major party, right? Knowing all the pressures they'd be under, that he had to shoulder that pressure and put the right thing down on paper. And he did, right? And if you want, contact Matt Canavan's office and thank him for the work he did. We often give elected officials a hard time and tell people, go and blast them. They also deserve positive feedback when they get it right. Make sure, if you're as excited about this as we are, contact his office and let him know he's done the right thing. So here's the recommendations that Craig was just referring to. The first one is overarching, and it's beautiful. The committee recommends the Australian government adopt a policy recognising access to financial services as an essential service. And then it specifies it should commit to guaranteeing reasonable access to cash and financial services for all Australians. And so the two things there, essential service is a legal designation. It's not just words. It carries legal obligations.
Which the banks fought for during COVID.
That's right.
Which is the irony, because
they wanted to be called an essential service so they didn't have to shut down.
That's right. But now that now that the COVID's finished, they're saying they want to have the freedom of doing things that effectively an essential service cannot do.
Exactly. And by stipulating cash, Craig, they've taken it out of the digital domain. Because the banks would have turned around and said, oh, well, we've provided people access to banking on the internet. No. It's got to be access to cash and financial services. It's taking it out of the digital domain. There's a minimum standard here. And from that, everything else flows.
And that's because you saw from time and time again at all the different inquiries, the biggest issue was the failure of the digital system,
exactly.
The failure of the internet. I mean, talking about Cooperpedy and these places, even in the city, places like Junee, which have intermittent internet capability. And you're talking about the failure of digital technology for older people and stuff. I mean, this was a recurring theme.
One of the richest men in Queensland, in Cloncurry, telling the story that sometimes, in order to do his payroll out there at Cloncurry, he gets in his helicopter and goes and hovers near the Telstra tower to get the reception he needs to do it for his computer to work.
Yeah,
right? Now, if we all had a helicopter, we probably wouldn't need cash.
Robbie, it's just not here in way out of Cloncurry. I mean, last night at 8:30, the Commonwealth Bank transfer app went down. Within 2 minutes, there was 3,000 people on downdetector.com complaining about the app had gone down. 3,000 people in 2 minutes.
Wow.
Right, I was one of them because I was trying to transfer some money too, and I was shocked. And you look at this thing, downdetector.com, and it tells you when the banks go down. And thousands and thousands, literally thousands of people were trying to do a transfer at that time. Now, that's a major bank. Yeah. Now, they got the problem solved pretty quick. But I've seen, look at the ANZ problem last year, where it went down for, 18 hours, 16 hours, or 18 hours or something. That's the problem. If there's
Whereas
no
if
backup,
you've got cash in your wallet,
that never goes down. No, it doesn't go
down. Just to mention in relation to this first recommendation, Jason Bryce and the organisation Cash Welcome, who led the Cash Out Tuesday campaign, his petition for a cash and banking guarantee is nearly up to 200,000 signatures on change.org. That cash and banking guarantee that the petition calls for is essentially what this recommendation is, right? So that part there is mission accomplished. And like I said, it's a legal obligation. Everything flows from that. Recommendation 2. This is enormous. The committee recommends the Australian Government commission an expert panel to investigate the feasibility of establishing a publicly owned bank. In investigating this, the panel should examine options including, but not limited to, a standalone public bank or one associated with and using the branch network of Australia Post. And Craig, we couldn't have asked for more. In fact, the only thing that they could have done more is not call for an expert panel, but actually just say we need a public bank.
No, but there has to be a public fight over this, Robbie, because...
Of course. There's a process.
The process is educating the Australian people, bringing them on board in order to get this bank. Now, some people have said to us, but expert panels are a way of shelving, parking the process. Well, we heard that before from other people that said in the cash ban thing, because the Labor Party had supported the cash ban and so forth, it's all finished now, it's all been done, you can't beat this, can't defeat this. And we said, hang on a sec, we haven't started to fight. And then we mobilised tens of thousands of people, and we overturned this cash ban to the point the government had to drop it. It's the same process here now.
Yep.
We have to ensure that this expert committee is properly chaired, properly staffed, and we have to have the people behind it. That's our job as a political party.
Well, we've called for, in relation to that, we have seized the initiative. We've put out a call yesterday for Anthony Albanese to appoint Christine Holgate, former CEO of Australia Post, current CEO of Team Global Express, to chair this expert panel. She would be the perfect person for the job. She has the experience in both banking and business. She had the vision at Australia Post to want to go down the path of a postal bank, and she made enemies because she had that, which is what was eventually her undoing there. We're the ones who exposed that in our campaign, right, around that. There's an acknowledgement that she was unjustly treated, so the politicians actually do have a lot more respect for her now than they did that week they all piled onto her. She did the right thing by Australia. This could be her legacy to actually oversee the process that delivers us the public bank, and we would still advocate for a postal bank.
I think that Albanese is now faced with winning or losing an election.
Yep.
This issue will either win him or lose him the election. If he plays around with this now, 12 months out from an election, if he stuffs around, he's gone. Because we intend to mobilise the forces necessary to get this bank. And if he's dithering, he's going to come against that blast of popular, rage, because he's not going to give us a public bank. Now, it was, you saw what happened in New Zealand with Jim Anderton and the formation of the Kiwi Bank. The Labor Party resisted Jim Anderton's call for Kiwi Bank, but he had the people behind him.
Yep.
So
we'll put that cartoon up. Actually, we did run this week.
He stood as a lone figure against the Labor Party, but as you see from the cartoon,
he's been kicked out of the cabinet, and you're on your own, Jim. But the cartoonists showed they actually had the whole people.
And that's what
we've
seen. That's what you've seen face to face with the inquiry.
Well, on the flip side of what you said, Craig, is that the other approach could work. Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party could recognise that, well, actually, because we are desperate to win, what do we need to latch onto to win? Here's a policy that's a winner, right? And that's what we're going to be putting out all the instructions for how you can contact your Labor members. We need all Labor members of Parliament contact. We need marginal seat MPs contacted. We'll provide all that information and marching orders. But if you're in a Labor seat, contact them now.
And the point, Robbie, is that politicians aren't terribly brave when it comes to thinking about getting elected, right, or losing their seat. They'll do whatever's necessary. Here they have one of the most powerful Senate committees, most successful series of meetings and hearings, the most detailed approach to this whole issue behind them with these recommendations. So the government has the excuse, oh, look, we've had this inquiry, we set it up, we can support this because this is what the people want.
Exactly.
You've got to have a withering defence against these damn lying bankers, because you're dealing with a money power here. And that's why you use the term money power. This is not just a bunch of bankers. This is an institutional, systemic bankers dictatorship run from overseas international institutions like the IMF, Bank of International Settlements, the Bank of England. So the enemy is very large, but we're here in Australia, they're over there, so we can do something about it.
And Craig, the banks actually don't have an argument against this, because if their line was right, that Australians don't want bank branches anymore, they don't want cash, we want to do digital banking, there's nothing about a postal bank that's a threat to them.
That's right.
Right? Because it shouldn't work. They should just not lose a second sleep over it, if they're right. But see, they know they're telling lies, and they're going to freak. But they're the ones who told those lies, and all the government's got to do is call them on it.
And one of the biggest lies, Robbie, is that, look at the history of public banking, look at all the state banks so forth. These banks were totally, they ripped the people off, they did the wrong thing. We had a public bank for 80 years.
No, I want to read the quote, then you can respond.
Oh, okay.
Australia, this was that night. Anna Bligh must have called up the Sydney Morning Herald straight away and said, "Ah!" This is what the Sydney Morning Herald quoted last Friday night. Australian Banking Association Chief Executive Anna Bligh sought to highlight the shift to digital banking, while also warning that establishing a new government-owned bank could threaten smaller banks that serve customers in regional areas. Quote, "Given the past catastrophic failures of state-owned banks in this country, Australians should be wary of suggestions of a new taxpayer-funded government-owned bank," she said.
Yeah, bullshit. Sorry. There's nothing but bullshit in that, because we've had the Commonwealth Bank as a public institution for 84 years. 84 years. The
state bank's about 150.
Yeah, but the process of destroying the state banks, Robbie, was not the bank's fault. It was a process of political undermining
That's right.
the integrity of the banking system through this neoliberal policy that we talked about and have talked about, coming in like a rot in this country for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
It was a deliberate political process. Jeff Kennett's privatisation of Victoria, because of the whole collapse of the state banks here in Victoria and all sorts of things like that.
It was sabotage.
Was sabotage, deliberate political sabotage, because it was a policy of looting coming out of the Montpellier Society to steal the assets of the people. And our population, our viewers should realise that this was a deliberate and absolutely disgusting, which is like, we'll go through this in our forums incidentally, Robbie, because I think, as you pointed out, and as Lisa has written a lot of good articles on this, if people don't understand what the rot is and when it comes in, you don't understand, they're going to be turned around.
But when you have a century of public banks, and this woman just zeroes in on one event or two of, like, it was essentially one event in the late 80s.
How could this woman be a member of the Labor Party?
That does not represent the history of public banking in Australia. And as Associate Professor Andy Schmulo responded to that particular claim, he said, well, what about the many, 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 many more failures of private banks?
Yeah.
Do we ban those as well? Right? It's such a self-serving, false argument. And that's because Professor Andy Schmulo is so smart on this, Craig. We've also recommended he should be part of the expert panel to look at this, because just in case they do try and sneak in a few bankers on there, you're going to need someone like Professor Schmulo to smack them down, right? To make sure this is actually an honest process. Let's just quickly go through the rest of the recommendations. Those are the two big ones, but the rest are all significant in their own right. Recommendation 3 is basically urgent. The government should urgently develop a mandatory banking code of conduct in place of what is effectively a voluntary code of conduct.
That's in response to the fact that bankers are liars.
That's right.
That's what that means.
They've been a law unto themselves for so long. They've had this voluntary code of conduct, and it just has been a total disaster.
It allows them to lie and go on.
So they will be screaming about that. I'm calling that the Linda White recommendation. The Labor senator who participated in this inquiry the most, who tragically a few months ago passed away, Senator Linda White. She was so hot on that. She was so dynamic in the hearings, and her exchange with Anna Bligh in the September hearing in Canberra was something to see. She locked horns with her and gave her the rounds of the kitchen over this, and so her views are reflected in that recommendation, and good on her. This is going to be her legacy. Recommendation 4, enforcing the mandatory banking code. The committee recommends the regulator be authorised to approve or defer a closure request. And that's
wow.
The banks are they're not going to be able to stand this, right? And an example I gave is in the first hearing, Craig. The first hearing established that what should surprise people the most is that when banks close branches, it's not because they're unprofitable. And most people up until that point would have assumed that the banks are thinking they're unprofitable. They had to admit, no, that's not a factor in closing. So if they can't even establish that, because see, if a bank went to a regulator and said, look, this branch is genuinely unprofitable, here's the books, etc. No regulator is going to make them keep it open, because the banks are not a charity, we accept that. But they couldn't do that. In 99% of cases, they couldn't do that. And so that regulator is not going to approve that, right? And the banks know the jig is up with that recommendation. Recommendation 5, the committee recommends the government commission the ACCC, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, to explore the barriers to customers switching banks. And there's always been barriers to customers switching banks, but the government, and this is such a charade that's been run for a long time, because every time a banking problem comes up, whether it's the government or the opposition, they say, oh, the solution is more competition. If you don't like your bank, switch. But the actual switch is very difficult, right? But that's all they come up with. And the reason they recommend that is because they're in the pockets of the banks and they know how difficult it is, but it sounds good, right? And the media's in on this as well. So now Matt Canavan's recommendations are, that's got to go. People have to make this easier to switch, right? And if they make it easy to switch, they'll all want to switch to the postal bank. And then 6 is a levy on the increasing the levy on the banks, so that if some communities want to do a community bank model, and it's quite expensive now, the banks actually subsidise that, right? So if the banks are going to abandon the communities and all the communities left with is a community bank model, well, the bank's going to pay. That's a good recommendation. Recommendation 7 is that the Australian government requires all banks to use Bank at Post. So, for instance, that particular recommendation is aimed at ANZ, which famously does not use Bank at Post. And I've told the story about, for instance, my father is in Childers,
Yeah.
near Bundaberg. They had an ANZ bank. It closed. He has to go to Bundaberg now because he can't use the post office. And he told me the story of a young single mother or something who was using the ANZ ATM that was left in town. The ATM ate her card. She couldn't travel to Bundaberg very easily, but she couldn't go into the post office to solve it because ANZ doesn't use the post office. Now, the reason ANZ doesn't is because Shane Elliott has been whinging from the beginning that when Christine Holgate set up the Bank at Post deal. He told the Australian Financial Review, I'm half the size of CBA, yet Aussie Post wants to charge me the same flat cost for that service, and we didn't think that was fair. But here's the thing, Craig. ANZ is now half the size of CBA in branch numbers, but it didn't start that way. At its peak, ANZ had 617 branches, CBA 650, NAB 760, and Westpac 777. So ANZ was just barely below CBA at its peak in 1975. They have shut down 73% of all branches. So now they're saying, oh, look how small we are as a branch bank. You did that to yourselves. And so the committee's called them on it, right? Which is really, really good. And then finally, recommendation 8, it's a more minor one. Basically, the committee recommends the ACCC exempt banks from some competition rules so that if in a remote enough location, it really is difficult to maintain staff in that. At the moment, the banks can't pool their resources. This recommendation says there should be some circumstances where they can pool their resources. So use one building, the same staff to serve the customers of banks. Basically a private version of what Bank at Post does. And that's a sensible recommendation as well. So those are those recommendations. I also want to highlight Senator Jared Rennick added additional comments, and we've published them in our magazine this week. Senator Jared Rennick is the other person on the committee who deserves enormous credit. He's the guy who instigated this inquiry. He got it up. He made sure it happened, and Australians have a lot to thank him for. He put in these additional comments saying, the advantages of a public bank are many and can be outlined as follows, because he's just called straight out for a public bank. 1, the restoration of banking services for vulnerable community groups. 2, lower social costs for taxpayers. And he describes, this is the wording, this is extraordinary. The major banks, despite claiming to be private, are in fact protected by the taxpayer in the form of a strange fascist/socialist hybrid model. And when you see the word fascist,
that's what neoliberal.
When Craig's talking about the Mont Pelerin Society and that neoliberal thing, that is what it actually has its roots in fascism.
That's what it is.
And Senator Rennick has actually acknowledged that.
Nailed it.
Where the public wealth props up the private sector, right? And he's saying that if you have he said banks cannot have it both ways. They cannot be allowed to privatise profits while socialising losses. 3, the introduction of ethical competition and less regulation, and which is an interesting thing, but it's right. The tension that comes from competition is more effective than all the regulation you can apply. So in this list of 8 recommendations, if our postal bank wasn't part of it, it would be much, much weaker, right? Even if it's going to go through a mandatory code of practice, just because the banks can throw an army of lawyers at all regulations, but they can't throw an army of lawyers at competition. They either attract their customers or they die, right? So he's pointed that out. 4, a public bank could be used to administer a government-run superannuation fund. The super sector, the people, there's about $30 billion that people in the super sector make out of fees, right? It's a whole trough that all these snouts are in. They're going to hate the idea of a publicly run super fund. A public bank could also offer longer-term fixed mortgages. This is really important. People may know, just briefly, that America has 30-year fixed interest rates. We don't have that here. The reason America has that is because Franklin Roosevelt set up Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so the fluctuations in the money market get borne by this public authority, right? And it absorbs the fluctuations. And sometimes it makes losses and sometimes it makes profits. But by being a public authority, it can do that. That allows the private banks who provide the mortgages to offer 30-year mortgages, right? So that the actual customer benefits from the stability. And that's what a public institution can do.
Because it takes say in a government-owned system, it takes the power of the entire government, takes the resources of the nation, and it puts it behind the people. And it says we can do this because we can even out the bumps instead of allowing a private system, you know, to have this incredible, disgusting and genocidal in the sense of the sort of disastrous impact it had on people's lives. The interest rates going from say 2% to 6%, and smashing people.
And now, because inflation's going up a bit, now it's actually on the cards that interest rates could go up even more, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And you know that's just crushing for so many people. 6, the creation of a public bank could operate in conjunction with the creation of a government-owned insurance office.
Oh,
that is beautiful because
again, the power of a government to underwrite, you know, insurance events is huge because the private insurers are trying to make a big buck for their shareholders all the time. So you have this tension coming in again, not just in the banking sector, but in the insurance sector.
Craig, there was a report last night on the news about loyalty with insurance companies. You aren't rewarded for loyalty.
No.
I experienced this recently where my premiums went up through the roof. I hadn't been paying that close attention, and I challenged it, and they brought it down a certain amount. But then the competitor said, "Well, it's half. We offer it at half the rate." But in the story that was on, it might have been on Channel 10, they actually highlighted these major offenders, and two of the ones they highlighted was SGIO in Perth, WA, and SGIC in Adelaide. And when they didn't say the acronym, they said the name: State Government Insurance Commission, State Government Insurance Office. And I'm thinking, because you know the history of Australian insurance is we had these government insurance offices, and they were claiming these ones were the biggest offenders. But I knew something that they didn't report on radio, and I actually just confirmed the dates. Back in the early 1980s, these things were privatised. They're no longer anything to do with the state government. They were set up to be government insurers to provide cheap insurance. Now they're part of the private sector, owned by the two big insurance companies, right, that own all insurance in Australia, and they're milking people. And the only solution to that is go back to a insurance provider, because just a quick explanation, insurance is like a pool, right? And everyone pays in and you get paid out as you need it. But when it's a government insurance, there's only one inlet and one outlet, the paying in and the paying out for claims. When it's private insurance, there's the paying in, the paying out for claims, which has a block on it, a tap on it that they squeeze, and then a much bigger channel called profits. And it's always siphoning out the profits from this pool. And when Queensland 100 years ago set up its state government insurance, it was the first one to do it. It was so successful in the first year because there was no profit being made. They actually were giving, after a year, just 1 year, they were paying back the premiums to the clients because the pool had grown so fast, and they were paying the clients back. This is what public can do, right?
And that's why, again,
the private sector just
you see that potentiality for the cash flow in the community, and that's why the Multiparty Society and the neoliberal policies, that's what they see, and they say, we want that.
Exactly.
Right, we want that. Take that money out of the community, we want that. So
get rid of the government ownership element, take the government out of it, because then we don't have any check on us just hoovering it up.
So it's a political fight between the idea of supporting the general welfare and the development of the population for the benefit of the population as opposed to private profits.
Yeah. Jared Rennick's last two benefits is the bank can actually, the profits it makes can fund the development bank, and he cites the example of the Commonwealth Development Bank that was started by the Menzies government in 1959. And his last point is it could be a one-stop shop where the standalone are in the post offices for all government services as well, right? So, because that's its own issue, the government services. So he has an unequivocal recommendation there, the establishment of a government-owned bank that will maintain bank branches in regional and metropolitan communities.
You could have bank branches in every Centrelink office around the country, every Medicare office, right?
Yeah, you could. All right. Now, just quickly, we did this. I want to get on to the next thing, but just some acknowledgements. The first acknowledgement is us, in the sense that the Citizens Party, you, our viewers, our activists, we did this. We powered this inquiry. We got it up and we powered it. Now, we didn't do it alone, but that the reason I'm highlighting that first is because every time you take the effort to make that call, send that email, make that submission, you can sometimes wonder, does this do anything? This is an unequivocal example where yes, it does. The best contrast I can give you, and we may even have a clip here, and if there is, I'll get the producer to stick it in.
And if there have been any lessons learned, Mr. Speaker, over the last 30 years in Australia, it is the government should not be involved in banking.
15 years ago, Joe Hockey was the Shadow Treasurer, and he gets up in Parliament and he says, if there's one thing we've learned from the global financial crisis, it's that government should not be involved in banking. That was the high watermark of neoliberalism. 15 years later, his own side has presided over an inquiry that has recommended a government bank. We have beaten these guys backwards. The banks are losing their minds, and it's only through persistence, sheer effort, and engagement, citizen engagement. As you know, as my contribution to these forums that you talked about is, the title is Citizen Engagement Works. This is the best example so far that it actually works. So that's the first acknowledgement. But there's other very significant acknowledgements. I've already acknowledged the senators. Dale Webster, you know, history hinges on extraordinary people, just like Christine Holgate and people like Angela Cram are extraordinary people in relation to the post office position. We'll talk about them more in a second. But Dale Webster grew up in the back of banks, regional banks, because her dad was an ANZ bank manager. And so, motivated by a personal connection, she's a professional journalist and a really good one, she decided to tell the story of the crisis in regional bank closures. And the work she did that we were able to use as ammunition to make sure people saw it, but it wouldn't have had anything to use if she hadn't done the work. And her engagement with this inquiry was exceptional, and she deserves enormous credit from regional Australia for the outcome. Martin North, our good collaborator for the last 6 years, who co-wrote a letter with Dale to this committee asking for this inquiry. He also, by the way, now Martin's a POM and he's back over in the UK now. I did a show with him last week, but he spends all his time paying attention to Australia. He grew up with a father who was a bank manager too. And so he had that connection. And then, of course, I've already mentioned Senator Rennick. Finally, the towns. Really, the towns that participate, the towns that fought for their banks, and I'm talking Coober Pedy, Carnama, and Junee. Those were the three big ones that fought really hard to save their last banks in town. Junee won its fight, Coober Pedy and Carnama didn't, but the fight they put up got the attention that helped us get this inquiry.
And there was elements, Robbie, the local councillors, particularly some of the CEOs, played a crucial role in this, where they actually went out somewhat on a limb.
They showed real leadership.
And showed real leadership in the area, and that was appreciated.
Rob Paul of Carnama, Tim Jackson and David Kelly of Coober Pedy, and James Davis of Junee, I take my hat off to you. You did a brilliant job representing your communities, fighting for your communities, and it's all contributed to this outcome. That's so important. All towns should take a leaf out of that book. Now at the next local government association event, Craig, the Australian Local Government Association event next month, there is a motion on the table for the Australian Local Government Association to support the Postal Bank recommendation.
And they can stand up and say, here's a senator report
exactly.
that supports
it.
And that's where this political ammunition is incredibly important.
So there's a lot more to be done, but you've got to be able to take that breather at the end of your D-Day victory. We stormed the beaches of Normandy, we've got to the top, we've taken over the German embattlements, right? We've now established the beachhead to win this fight with this report, and you guys deserve all the credit. Okay, let's move on quickly, because here's the reality check. No post office bank without post offices. And we're highlighting this because it's actually getting quite serious. What we're putting up is the ultimate win-win solution here. A postal network, the infrastructure, the actual post offices support banking services. The building's already there. That's what makes a postal bank such an efficient operation. In turn, the banking revenue helps to fund that network. That's the win-win symbiosis of a postal bank. It's a beautiful model. Successful post offices around the world have combined it with banking services. That's what Christine Holgate noticed, and that's why she had the vision of that for Australia. The problem we have right now is Australia Post wants to get rid of Australia's post offices. Once they got rid of Christine Holgate, the current management of Australia Post, they are gunning for the post offices. So, Craig, there is a minimum requirement that the Australia Post is obliged by law to maintain 4,000 postal outlets. At its peak, there were 4,327. Australia Post is aggressively shutting down that 327. They've got 200 of them already shutting down. They're shutting down the rest to get down to the bare 4,000, right? That is already having an enormous destructive effect in the communities around the country that are losing their post offices. Now, the Australia Post Modernisation Review that took place a few months ago, well, it actually started the day, the first hearing in Sale, I remember. It said, no, we have to maintain this minimum standard, but the Australia Post was lobbying, they wanted to get rid of the minimum standard. It said, no, we have to maintain it. But the wording was important. The Modernisation Review said we must maintain a minimum of 4,000 postal outlets. The licensed post office group wanted that to be specified and defined as 4,000 manned postal outlets, and the government refused. They did not define it as manned postal outlets. And with the mentality of Australia Post right now, they're gunning for those post offices. Now, I want to play a clip. This is 5 minutes from back in February, a bit less than 5 minutes, of the Senate Environment and Communications Committee Senate estimates hearing with Australia Post, and it's a senator talking to the CEO of Australia Post, Paul Graham, and she's asking about their policy of buying out licensed post offices, right, to shut them down. Now he's justifying it, and he's trying to soften it and make out it's all done in a nicey way. When you listen to this, I want you to consider the demoralisation that's been accepted, both in terms of these things are not viable, the towns are not viable. You'll feel the demoralisation oozes out of it, which is the opposite of what Christine Holgate did. Christine Holgate took over Australia Post, and she saw the postal offices, the network, was its biggest asset. Put up our map of Australia with all the post offices marked. No retail business in Australia has that footprint. Australia Post does, and she thought, this is our best asset. This is not an expense. This is what we are. She's been replaced by people who see it all as an expense and want to get rid of it, and you'll see that in this clip. So watch this clip of Senator Perrin Davey, who's a National, talking to Australia Post CEO Paul Graham.
You mentioned in your opening statement that you are looking at devising a process of buyback of select LPOs to allow them an exit option. Predominantly what areas are these LPOs that you're looking at? Are they only in suburban areas, or are there certain rural and remote that Australia Post might buy and turn into a corporate post office?
No, Senator, they're only focused in metropolitan areas, and in a metropolitan area where another postal service is within 1.7 kilometres. So we've been very, very specific on targeting those licensees where we think there's significant overlap in that geographic area, where we know from the commissions that we pay them and looking at their viability that they may be facing some economic uncertainty, and hence the buyout is to allow them to exit and leave that business and hand that licence back. What we find is that the revenue that they give up with that closure then moves into other licensees or corporate post offices in the area, hence making them more sustainable. It's a very targeted, very specific program, and we have not opened that up, nor do we anticipate opening it up to regional or rural.
So when you have a regional area that has a licensed post office potentially owned by a couple that are entering their twilight years and they're seeking to retire and they can't find a buyer for the licence, what happens in those communities? Are they just left without a licensed post office? Or I note that in just in the last year alone, there's been certain towns too in Dalgety and Woodstock in New South Wales and Lock and Sebastopol in Victoria, where instead of licensed post offices, they've converted to the community postal agent. But my reading is that community postal agents have to be manned by volunteers. The small subsidy that Australia Post provides does not cover wages or any additional services. So there's no option in those centres where, I'm thinking Deniliquin, it's a town of 7,000, and I love my licensed post office. Alan and Shirley, hello. And I'm not hoping you're retiring, I'm just using you as an example. But if they wanted to retire and there was a lack of interest, what happens then?
Well, it's a very good question, Sandra, and that's one of the challenges that we face. And indeed, you're absolutely spot on. We are seeing a demographic shift of a lot of our licensees. I've been out visiting a lot of them in regional and rural areas. They're in their twilight years, looking to retire after decades of fantastic service to that local community. Unfortunately, the community and people who are business people know that that is a sunset business and it's not financially viable. Therefore, it makes it very, very difficult to attract people to take over that licence. What we then do is work with the community to understand the range of services that they require, and we then work with other businesses, and it may then be put in conjunction with the local pharmacy or the local IGA, but it is a difficult situation. We are very, very mindful, particularly where we have a bank at post operation and we are the only bank at post in town, and we will find a solution to ensure that that community gets access to the provision of cash. But I think it's part of the broader change we're seeing in regional towns where, unfortunately through digitisation, through other avenues, the traditional foot traffic that we would see in our post office is dying out. I was in one of our regional post offices recently and they want to get a temporary person in just to help them out on Friday and Saturday morning, can't even get the labour, never mind someone interested in taking over the business. So it's a real challenge, but we are very committed to trying to find solutions with the community in relation to that, but it is difficult.
Now this is one of those issues, Craig. Remember when we took up the Australia Post issue with Christine Holgate? I remember feeling an epiphany that here's post offices that we just take them for granted.
Yeah.
But what that issue taught us is how much they were hanging on by a thread in Australia. And I felt really bad for not having noticed that before, right? So that may seem sort of mundane, but the implications of what you just watched there is the assumption is this is a dying network. He actually said these are dying businesses. He called his own businesses unviable. Christine Holgate made them viable. She made that her mission. He wants them to be unviable so they can have the excuse of buying them out and shutting down the network. And by the way, they're offering to buy them out for 1.5 times revenue, which is pittance, right? Companies trade on the ASX for on an average 12 times revenue. This is rubbish. Anyway, so if they get their way, we won't have a postal network to have a postal bank in. Whereas if we get the postal bank, it creates the revenue the postal network needs to survive. It is literally win-win. We save 2 essential services, banking and postal services in one fell swoop, right? What's not to like unless you're these predatory, parasitical, vested interests in the banks and whoever's circling Australia Post to privatise it, they're the only ones that are not going to like this. So that's why it really is a case to support your local post office right now.
And to support us in this battle, because look, the key is, what you've said before. I mean, we've got a team, I count them up in the morning. We have a team of about 30 people on our morning meetings.
Yep.
Now they're from all over the country,
Australia,
all around Australia and further. And when we come to these mobilisations, everything is focused into let's get this job done. So whatever is required is put into it.
Yep.
Now we've been doing that on this issue particularly since Christine Holgate, and we actually took her from being absolutely demonised and abused into being a figure that should be leading this, at the minimum should be the chairman of this expert committee, because what she represents is a type of entrepreneurial thinking, the type of careful thinking, and I mean care in the sense of caring for people thinking.
Exactly. And problem solving that goes with that. Because
you bring out then the creativity of people, their entrepreneurial, and look, the small business person, the people that are given the opportunity to do what they really passionately want to do, they're the backbone of our country. Now you can either smash it with neoliberal policies, and stifle the credit through private banking, or you can do the opposite. And that's what these parasites actually are afraid of, is the explosion of creativity, of enthusiasm, and the increase in productivity. Once that happens, Robbie, it doesn't have to be for very long.
No.
And people say, what is
Where
this
was
shit
this
that
all
been?
along?
What is this shit we've been handling for 40 years? Why
And
have we
they'll
been
never go
tolerating
back.
this? And they'll never go back.
No,
and
they'll
that
never
means
go
that
back.
there'll be more regulation towards controlling the parasites. There'll be all sorts of stuff done with ASIC to bring them into line,
Yep.
and APRA. And this report is the beginning of that, and the banks know it, right? And this is why this is it's a big fight, and it begins now. The next stage of the fight, we've got, as you say, we've made the successful landing on the Normandy beaches. The war went on for another year,
That's right.
right? So we've got a lot of work to do, but it's people power. It's the ability of people to get behind this process. And we always say, if someone does just that little bit more than they did yesterday towards this process, then that's a huge amount when you put it all together.
So if you're in one of those areas where you're losing a post office, it doesn't matter if you're in regions, cities as well. If you're losing a post office and you want to fight for your post office, understand, get behind the fight for the postal bank. We've got
And
to bring
fight
the
with
two
your
together.
fight with your local councillors, and if they're not coming on board with you,
Get them involved.
Get 'em out.
All levels.
Get people in there.
They represent the people. These are the solutions they can get behind.
Yep.
Anyway, Craig, this has been our week of patting ourselves on the back. We'll now move on to the next stage. The next stage of the fight begins now. We'll have our breather, and we're going to get this job done. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
You're welcome.
Thanks to the viewer for joining us. Pat yourself on the back, and see you next week on the Citizens Report. Give me
Yes.
5.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.